Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman. A warning to our audience, our top stories contain graphic images of violence. Israeli forces stormed the Al-Aqsa Mosque in occupied East Jerusalem this morning amidst mounting violence in recent days. Soldiers deployed rubber bullets, tear gas, sound bombs at Palestinians, injuring hundreds. Over the weekend, Israeli forces wounded hundreds more worshippers and protesters at Al-Aqsa, including on one of the holiest nights of Ramadan. Protests have been growing against the expulsion of Palestinian families from Sheikh Jarrah, a neighborhood in occupied East Jerusalem.
The plan is to occupy all of Jerusalem and turn it into a Jewish ethnic developing city that lacks an Arab presence. And this allows them to occupy the Palestinian capital, and this allows them to get all the homes, like they did in Nakba in 1948 and in 1967.
On Sunday, Israel's Supreme Court postponed a hearing set for today on the planned evictions from Sheikh Jarrah. The court will schedule a new date within 30 days. Meanwhile, the nationalist Israeli holiday Jerusalem Day and its annual flag march is going ahead today, prompting fears of further violence. We'll have more on this after headlines with the writer and poet Mohammed El-Kurd, who's organizing to save his family's home in Sheikh Jarrah. In Afghanistan, at least 85 people, mostly schoolgirls, were killed after several bombs exploded outside a school in the capital, Kabul, Saturday. Devastated families buried their loved ones amidst mounting despair and anger.
Our message to the government is that they should ensure our peace and security. Also, our message to the blind-hearted enemy is that there are so many incidents in Kabul. They should stop the violence and accept peace and stability. Until when will we bury the dead bodies? Our government officials only apologize and show sympathy, which doesn't cure our pain.
The blasts occurred in a neighborhood mostly populated by the minority Hazara Shia community. The Afghan government blamed the Taliban, though the group denied responsibility. The massacre came 1 week after U.S. and NATO forces began their military withdrawal from Afghanistan and as violent attacks are surging. Elsewhere in the country, at least 11 people were killed and dozens, including women and children, were injured in a bus bombing in southern Zabul province late Sunday. We'll have more from Afghanistan later in the broadcast. India's government faces growing calls for a nationwide lockdown as its health ministry reported 366,000 new coronavirus infections and nearly 3,800 deaths today. Those figures are down only slightly from world records set by India last week and fail to account for widespread underreporting. Health officials say recent super spreader events have combined with a more transmissible coronavirus variant to drive a massive surge in cases.
So this new mutant strain has high infectivity compared to last time. So more than 5 times the number of people are getting affected in the second wave. That's the speciality of these two strains, the UK strain and the Maharashtra strain.
The World Health Organization warns India is driving surges elsewhere in Asia, with cases rising in Nepal, Sri Lanka, Thailand, Cambodia, Indonesia, and elsewhere. In Pakistan, officials have ordered a 9-day partial lockdown ahead of the Eid holiday marking the end of the Muslim month of Ramadan. Tunisia has begun a week of coronavirus restrictions, including during the Eid holiday, with the Prime Minister warning Tunisia faces the worst health crisis in its history. Meanwhile, Brazil's official COVID-19 caseload has topped 15 million, the third highest in the world, after India and the United States. Infectious disease experts say far-right President Jair Bolsonaro is largely to blame for the pandemic's devastating toll.
Tudo isso em função de uma política.
All of this COVID pandemic is down to a disastrous policy from the federal government of an anti-scientific policy of denial.
In vaccine news, the World Health Organization approved China's Sinopharm's vaccine for emergency use Friday. This is WHO Director General Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus.
This expands the list of vaccines that COVAX can buy and gives countries confidence to expedite their own regulatory approval and to import and administer a vaccine.
Sinopharm is the sixth vaccine to receive emergency use approval by the WHO. Here in the United States, Pfizer is requesting full approval from the Food and Drug Administration for its vaccine for people 16 and older. All three COVID vaccines currently in use in the United States have emergency use authorization. If successful, the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine would be the first to be fully approved. In Iraq, unidentified gunmen on motorbikes assassinated prominent journalist and anti-corruption activist Ahab al-Wazni near his home in the city of Karbala early Monday. His killing follows the murders and kidnappings of dozens of other activists who joined an October 2019 anti-government uprising to demand jobs, better services, and an end to corruption. Hundreds of people were killed during those protests. Local activists blame armed militias backed by Iran for the continuing violence, and protests have erupted in Karbala. This is a journalist speaking from al-Wazni's funeral Sunday.
This killing operation can happen to any civil society activist. At any time, we could see a friend or a colleague or any protester or civil society activist be killed easily and his blood shed, and the government does not do anything. Why hasn't it disclosed who killed the protesters?
Back in the United States, a gunman shot and killed 6 people at a birthday party in Colorado Springs Sunday. The gunman, who was reportedly in a relationship with one of the female victims, also shot and killed himself. There were children present, but none of them were killed or injured. The Colorado massacre comes after a rash of gun violence Saturday. In Baltimore, 4 people, including the gunman, were killed during a shooting and 2 alarm fire. In New York City's Times Square, 2 women and a 4-year-old girl were injured after a shooting. And in South Florida, 3 people were wounded by gunfire in a shopping mall Saturday. According to the Gun Violence Archive, there have been nearly 200 mass shootings since the beginning of the year. In related news, the Justice Department proposed a new rule Friday to crack down on so-called ghost guns, home-assembled, unregulated firearms that account for about a third of guns recovered at crime scenes. The rule says retailers would have to run background checks before selling ghost gun kits, and components would need to include serial numbers. 3D printed guns would also need to start carrying serial numbers. The Justice Department has filed federal criminal charges against Derek Chauvin and 3 other former Minneapolis police officers involved in the murder of George Floyd last May. The indictment charges Chauvin, who was convicted of murdering Floyd, of using unreasonable force. The 3 others, Thomas Lane, Alexander King, and Toe Tao, are accused of failing to provide Floyd with medical care, and 2 of the men with failing to intervene and stop Chauvin from killing Floyd. The 3 former officers are also still facing state charges of aiding and abetting the murder and manslaughter of George Floyd. In a separate case, former police officer Derek Chauvin also faces a federal indictment for violating the civil rights of a 14-year-old boy from Minneapolis, whom he grabbed by the throat, hit multiple times with a flashlight, and whose neck he kneeled on during a 2017 arrest. In North Carolina, a judge ruled the family of Andrew Brown Jr. will only be allowed to see a fraction of the body camera footage of his killing. Brown was a 42-year-old black father who was shot 5 times by police officers last month, including a fatal shot to the back of the head. The family, which has so far only seen 20 seconds of body cam video, will be shown less than 20 minutes of the 2 hours of tape that was recorded. The footage will not be available to the public. Faith leaders, loved ones, community members marched in Elizabeth City Saturday to demand transparency and justice for Andrew Brown. This is his aunt, Lily Brown Clark.
We need to see the body cams. 20 seconds. Not enough.
Not enough.
20 minutes. Not enough. We want to see the whole tape. Stop snipping and showing us what you want to show us.
The Colonial Pipeline company halted shipments of fuel across the eastern United States over the weekend after suffering what executives said was a ransomware attack Friday. The cyber attack idled a pipeline network that transports nearly half the East Coast fuel supply from Texas to New Jersey. In response, the Biden administration enacted emergency powers, lifting limits on the transport of fuels by road to compensate for any shortages. U.S. officials blame the criminal gang DarkSide, which mostly mostly operates out of Russia. It was the Colonial Pipeline company's worst crisis since last summer, when a pipeline rupture in North Carolina spilled at least 1.2 million gallons of gasoline, the largest spill in the state's history. And Senator Bernie Sanders, Congressmember Ilhan Omar, and other Democratic lawmakers have introduced a bill to make all school meals free for every student. Congressmember Omar noted 3/4 of school districts have school meal debt, and the new bill would, quote, eliminate school meal debt and strengthen local economies by incentivizing local food procurement. Some 13 million children in the U.S. live in food-insecure homes. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman.